Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel Code with Shireen. I'm here today with the second episode of Python programming, and today we're going to explore the input statements. The content to be covered today will be the difference between input and output in the Python language, and secondly, how do we use the input statements to take user input. So before we jump into looking at how do we use the input statements, let's start off with the difference between input and output. So over here you have two pictures, and there are two different activities that are being performed here. If you observe the first picture, the boy is watching something, so that means he is basically receiving some information from a device. So we consider this as an output. On the other hand, in the second picture, we have a person signing in into an application, which basically means he's giving back some information back into an application, and this is known as input. So what is input and output in Python? Output is basically any information you see on the screen when you're using any application. That could be in the form of pictures, videos, links, sounds, and even text. Whereas input is basically any information that you as a user would give back to an application so that that information can be processed. A very simple example is when you're trying to sign in into an application, when you're filling up a form, when you're filling up a survey, all the information that you give back to the application is basically referred to as input. So if you remember from last time, we worked on our print statements. In Python, print was used to display any kind of textual value onto the output screen. So in Python, we refer to it as the output. Whenever we want to display some information onto the screen, we use the print statement, and this was the syntax that we used to print something. On the other hand, now if we want the user to give back some information into our program, into our Python code, we are now going to introduce a new statement which is called the input statement, and this is what the input statement looks like. Very similar to the print statement, but the functionality is very different, and that's what we're going to explore today. So let's look at how do we use an input statement. Here is an example of an input statement, and the question or the statement within our input statement says enter your name. Remember, the input statement always takes back information from the user, so obviously the statement which goes inside a print statement is usually a question where the user has to respond back or interact with the program. So in this case, when I run this code into my Python compiler, it is going to wait for me in order to give back some information into the code. So this was the syntax of the input statement, and we're going to look at how do we use that in the Python language as well. But let's just look at the difference between the print and the input statement. So this is the example of the print and the input statement. I would suggest you pause this video right here and run the two statements on your compiler and see what exactly is the difference between the print statement and the input statement. And I'm also going to show it to you in a while as well. Right, so I'm back into my Python compiler. If you remember, we're using the replit.com website. It's a very advanced Python compiler that we looked at last time as well. So taking the two statements that I showed you in the previous slide, these were the print and the input statements. Now let's just run both of them and see what's happening onto the output screen. So as soon as I hit my run button, it shows me the first statement, which was hello, I'm in 6T, as well as the next statement, what is your name? Now, two things to observe over here. First of all, if you look at this run the button which was used to run your code, it is showing me or indicating me to stop the program, which basically means that the program is still running and it has not stopped. Second, you see this white cursor over here? This is an indicator that is telling me to write something back, or it's waiting for me to respond back to the code. So here I can respond back and write by name, and as soon as I press enter, it's going to come to the next line of code. Now in this program, obviously there is no other line, so it stops the program and doesn't display anything. But let's try adding one more line of print statement and see what happens then. So I'm going to use my print statement and I'm going to say welcome, right? So now we have 3 lines of code. Let's see what happens when we run this. So I run it. The first line of code, hello, I'm in 60, is there, as well as what is your name, and the cursor is still blinking. It's still there for me to answer back. So I'm going to answer back. One more thing to observe over here, the third line of code, which was welcome, has not printed yet because my second statement, which was the input statement, is basically not complete because I had not responded back to the question. But as soon as I respond back and I press the enter button, it's going to go to the third line of code, or whatever lines of codes you have next, that is then going to print. So you see the difference between the input statement and the print statement. The input statement is basically allowing you or the user to give back or interact with the application somehow, but the print statement only allows you to print any kind of text onto the output screen. Again, I would suggest you pause the video over here, try out as many examples of the print and the input statements side by side, and try to create a small quiz program, if you like, using the print and the input statements. Right, so I've given you the basics of how to use the input statement along with some print statements. Here are some more examples for you to try out. You can use my examples to run these and see how the input statements and the print statements work, or I would actually suggest create your own statements in combination of print and input statements, and this would give you a more clearer idea of how the inputs work with the print statements. So I would suggest hit the pause button here and work on some examples for yourself. All right, so we have reached the end of our episode 2. This was a very short, quick tutorial on how to use the input statements. Try out both the print and the input statements for yourself and see how you can create a small program using the 2 statements. So that was it for my side for episode 2. Thank you very much everyone for joining in, and I would see you in episode 3 in my next tutorial. Do like my video and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you so much everyone.